Broadcasting live from the School of Athens, this is Europe and the People Without History with Mr. Olson, everyone's favorite AP World History Review service. So we're going to continue our discussion of Period 5 today, Period 5 in the AP World History Concept Outline, by talking about Key Concept 5.3, which states, the 18th century marked the beginning of an intense period of revolution and rebellion against existing governments, leading to the establishment of new nation-states around the world. Go ahead and give me a pause, come back, see what I wrote down. All right, so when I read this one, I come up with people in the 1700s began revolting against governments, which often sucked, which led to new nations throughout the world. So let's go ahead and get started, as this one is going to be chock full of information. So key concept 5.3 Roman numeral 1 says the rise and diffusion of Enlightenment thought that questioned established traditions in all areas of life often preceded revolutions and rebellions against existing governments. So let's talk about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a largely political movement of new ideas that challenged the status quo. It's important to make mention here, because I don't have it anywhere else in this presentation, that the status quo often involved absolute monarchies and mercantilist governments. If you don't recall what those are, mercantilist governments were, of course, economic systems in which the mother country was in control of all modes of trade and resource extraction. It was best exemplified by the Spanish in the New World. Spain oversaw everything down to the T to make sure that they were making a profit. Absolute monarchies, of course, are a form of government in which one person rules, often with divine right, saying that their power comes from God, and rules with a very heavy hand, and the people don't have a lot of say. So you can figure out what's wrong with that political system and then figure out what people wanted in response. So this largely political movement known as the Enlightenment emphasized the use of logic and reason to help understand the natural world that humans lived in and how humans related to and interacted with one another. It encouraged observation and using all of these things to help form a better society. It also re-examined the role of religion in post-Protestant Reformation. You have a very strict religious order, especially in Europe, and then oftentimes, since absolute monarchs said they were getting their power from God, it forced them to be overtly religious, and so the Enlightenment questions this religious dogma that has given us these absolute monarchs that tend to abuse their power. Many philosophers were what we call deists, which are basically people who believe that there is a supreme being who has created the universe and especially Earth. However, that supreme being has left the rest to be figured out by man, which is why the Enlightenment becomes so influential. 3 important Enlightenment philosophers that you should be aware of and be able to recognize. John Locke put forth the idea that humans have natural rights, including life, liberty, and property. That, of course, is an idea that is going to come up later when we talk about the American Revolution. Jean-Jacques Rousseau came up with the idea of the social contract, which said that people must sacrifice some of their individual rights for the sake of society. A better society will be one in which everybody gives up a little bit of their own stake. And then finally, Voltaire argued for freedom of speech, which of course was not the case under absolute monarchies, and then the separation of church and state, which also was not the case under absolute monarchies. Now, the importance of this Enlightenment, or of these Enlightenment ideals, are that they pave the way for the revolutions that are going to characterize the early part of period 5. In class, there's a good chance that your teacher had you fill out a chart, something like this. I know if you were in my class, you filled one out. It would be the best thing to study for this. Don't rely on me to tell you everything about the revolutions here. In fact, I'm not even going to talk about the American Revolution. You should have a chart like this, and you should consult it prior to your exam on period 5 and prior to the AP test. The College Board loves to ask questions about these revolutions, and therefore this is going to be a handy-dandy asset for you. Now, to begin, talking about the revolutions, let's talk about France first. The causes of the French Revolution, in addition to the American Revolution, are the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment ideals, money issues that were largely fostered by France's involvement in the American Revolution, and the inequality between the 3 estates. There was also famine throughout France, as there had been a bad harvest, and the French couldn't get their croissants, and so they got mad. Now, the major events that characterize this revolution, or that are associated with it, are the publication or creation of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, a document that was created in 1789, which basically made all French citizens equal under the law. It was a huge step in world history, very similar to the American Bill of Rights. But France did so without as much fighting as America did. Now, a less fun, awesome part of the French Revolution is, of course, the Reign of Terror. It's a period in which paranoia grips the revolution, and leaders of it are fearful that people are going to try and stop the revolution, and so they institute this Reign of Terror where they try to weed out anybody who's anti-revolution. Figures to associate with this revolution: absolute monarch King Louis XVI and Reign of Terror orchestrator Maximilien Robespierre. The outcome of this revolution is, of course, Napoleon, who rises to power as a result of France not being able to get their act together, and sort of political chaos that results from the revolution, sort of the wheels coming off, if you will. Now, in addition to Napoleon, you also see the emergence of French nationalism, because the French had created a lot of awesome things with regard to their revolution, like the abolition of slavery and political equality and the end of feudalism and the end of the monarchy. The French are feeling pretty proud, so you start to get the seeds sown for nationalism within the French Empire. Okay, the next revolution that is influential is that of Haiti. Causes of the Haitian Revolution, which the Haitian Revolution occurs between roughly 1791 and 1805. Causes: slavery, obviously, and then ideological origins in the French Revolution and the Enlightenment. Major events, so I wouldn't have battles or anything like that, but the abolition of slavery and the destruction of plantations. The destruction of plantations, of course, we shouldn't be mad at the Haitians for that, because if you lived in slavery for so long and you worked on plantations, I doubt that you would want those plantations around either. Major influential figures during this revolution is Toussaint Louverture. He leads it for most of the time until being tricked by the French and dying of pneumonia in a French prison. Outcomes of this revolution are that Haiti becomes the first black republic in the world, and also that it's ostracized from the world community, basically for being the first black republic in world history, and therefore it has endured unstable economic and political situations ever since. And finally, Latin American revolutions occurred largely because of the American, French, and Haitian revolutions, largely because of the Enlightenment, but mostly in response to Spanish colonial rule and the fact that the upper echelon of Latin American society, the Peninsulares, had angered people below them, notably the Creoles, who were the next in line. So the major events to associate with this series of revolutions, now there's so much going on in Latin America between 1790 and 1830 that it's hard to pinpoint battles or anything like that. So the major event that you need to know about is the Jamaica letter. The Jamaica letter is super important because the College Board always asks about it. So you can expect there to be some Jamaica letter related thing on the AP test, and your period 5 exams for that matter too. Figures in Latin American revolutions include Simón Bolívar, who of course was the author of that Jamaica letter, José de San Martín. Simón Bolívar led the independence effort in the northern part of South America. San Martín led it from the south. Eventually, Simón Bolívar takes the torch and leads most of it, but they're both influential. The outcome: most of Latin America becomes independent by 1830, as you can see by the map to the right, but then there's years of chaos and infighting. It is not The populations in Latin America are so heavily diverse. It's not like the populations of France. It's not like the population in Haiti. It's so diverse. There are indigenous peoples. There are mestizos, mulattoes, slaves, Creoles, some Peninsulares left over. There are all types of people, and so to get them all on the same page is very, very difficult. And so you have demographic issues in Latin America that take a long time to help work out. Now, in each of these examples, you see the Enlightenment ideas that we talked about first at work. So to see Enlightenment ideas at work in these various revolutions, let's talk about how the Enlightenment influenced the America's Declaration of Independence. In America's Declaration of Independence, it says, "They are endowed by their Creator certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Of course, an idea that we can attribute to John Locke. In France's Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, it says, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions can be founded only on the common good." So you see elements of the social contract theory there, and you also see elements of John Locke's natural rights as well. And then in Simone Bolivar's aforementioned Jamaica letter says, "It is plain that he who aspires to obtain liberty will at least attempt to secure it." So it's all about obtaining and securing those rights. All right, the Enlightenment philosophies also impacted societies. So you see it by way of abolishing serfdom. It's done in France in 1791 and Russia in 1861. Serfdom is not it does not coincide well with the Enlightenment, and so getting rid of it is an Enlightenment ideal. You also see anti-slavery efforts, first in Haiti and then in Britain, most intense in Britain, and Britain abolishes slavery in 1833, and then finally Brazil outlaws slavery in 1888, becoming the last republic in the world to have it. You go, Brazil. We're proud of you for abolishing it, not for having it so long. And then you also see expansions in suffrage or voting abilities. It's kind of hard to pinpoint one thing here, but there is a group of there's a political group in England that emerges out of the Industrial Revolution called the Chartists, and they push for expansion of suffrage or voting rights to people in England. And they actually win. They get it. So more people are able to vote as a result of the Enlightenment philosophies as well. Okay, key concept 5.3, Roman numeral 2 states, beginning in the 18th century, peoples around the world developed a new sense of commonality based on language, religion, social customs, and territory. These newly imagined national communities link this identity with the borders of the state, while governments use this idea of nationalism to unite diverse populations. In some case, nationalists challenged boundaries or sought unification of fragmented regions. Oh boy. Okay, so we're talking about nationalism in this one, and nationalism is the idea that faith and loyalty should be directed to a nation state, no longer one ruler. So it's an outgrowth of the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution both, because the nation state can not only provide you political safety, but also in economic safety as well. Now, it rests upon common interests between people in an area. So you have a similar geographic area, and then the people within it have a similar culture, similar history, similar language, and similar religion. They also have a similar common enemy. So places where this is going to be most effective is in Europe, where there's a lot of fighting going on. Places where this is not going to be as effective are places like Latin America, because there is very little by way of cultural, historical, language, unification. While most of the people there eventually become religiously homogenous, the other ones are harder to tackle. So nationalism in Latin America is kind of a slippery topic. It can go either way. Now, this idea of nationalism, to take kind of a break from content, is best discussed in the sixth best book, or my sixth favorite book ever, Imagined Communities, by a historian named Benedict Anderson. And in his book, he says it is an imagined political community. So nationalism is basically the emergence of people's imagination. And it is imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. It's a part of our imagination that these nation states exist. Nationalism is a cultural artifact, he says, of a particular kind. Now, you might think that this is ridiculous because you are so pro-United States, but as we said before, the College Board says these newly imagined communities link this identity with the borders of the state. They took a page out of Benedict Anderson's book. You go, College Board. You did something good. All right, to continue, let's give some examples of nationalism throughout the world. This is not exhaustive. I'm just giving you a couple of examples that are perhaps ones that you saw in class. So Italy unifies in the mid-1800s. I think by the mid-1860s, Italy is entirely unified. It's, of course, a unification of what had been independent Italian kingdoms. They had a common enemy, that of Austria from the north. They're led by Count de Cavour and Giuseppe Garibaldi, but eventually they are going to bring Italy under one banner. Germany undergoes a similar unification effort. It unifies Prussia with other German states, pictured here to the right. It is the biggest factor in their unification is a Franco-Prussian War. Obviously, that means they have a common enemy, that of France, and Otto von Bismarck leads this unification effort. He does so through a campaign where he indicates that blood and iron is what makes Germany special. Blood, of course, being their ability to beat other people in battle, and iron being their improved industrialization. And by the late 1800s, Germany will be the most industrialized country in Europe, save that of Britain. Other examples, Greece. They have an obvious common history that we've talked about. They also have a common enemy in uh, by way of the Ottomans, who force them to be a part of the Ottoman Empire. They are going to get their independence in 1830, well before Italy and Germany unify. And then to bring our discussion to East Asia, the Philippines also have a nationalistic movement in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They unify first against Spanish colonization and then eventually against American colonial rule, and they're led by a freedom fighter named Emilio Aguinaldo. So they also fight a battle for their nation state. Not listed here, but also one that you could think about is Japan. The Meiji Restoration ushers in a period of nationalism in Japan. Okay, key concept 5.3, Roman numeral 3. Increasing discontent with imperial rule propelled reformist and revolutionary movements. So people challenged centralized imperial rule within their own country. So first we're going to talk about how people responded to imperial governments within their borders. China had some issues with regard to controlling populations that did not jive with the dynastic power at the time. So the Qing have to put down two notable rebellions. One we'll talk about here, one we'll talk about later. But the Taiping Rebellion, that is initially begun by a Chinese Christian who thinks that his brother was Jesus, ended up in the slaughter of 100 million people, some estimates say. So they weren't happy with the Qing dynasty and their capitulation to outsiders, and so they staged this massive revolt. Slaves resisted throughout the world, as we already talked about with Haiti, but in North America, there's a famous slave revolt called Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831. There's also religious responses to imperialism. We already talked about the Taiping Rebellion being led by a Christian. But then you also have the Xhosa cattle killing in southern Africa, which is where a group that live in the Zulu kingdom respond to English encroachment and English imperialism by killing all of the cattle and destroying all of the plantations that provide them their food in hopes that it will send the imperialist powers away. Obviously, this does not work. However, if you know anything about this area of the world, it made sense for these people because this is what they put the most stake in, and they had no other explanation for what was going on. And so if you want to practice historical empathy, this is a good chance for you to do it, to try and understand why it would make sense for those people to kill that cattle, even though it led to the demise of their populations. Okay, now let's talk about how rebellions occurred against colonization in, say, the Americas. So in the Americas, you see there are rebellion against colonization in the form of the United States, the form of Haiti, in the form of Latin America. All these things led to independent states that aligned themselves with Western values and things like that. But those were already things we talked about, so no need to go into it here. Other rebellions that occurred against colonization in Asia include the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857 and 1858, where Indian soldiers revolted against the British. Famous story here, I'm sure that you learned about it in class, that the Muslim and Hindu soldiers in the British Army called the Sepoys were being asked to use pig fat to grease their guns, and they didn't want to do it. And this cultural insensitivity of the British eventually caused the Sepoys to revolt in a massive revolt that, while it failed to overthrow British rule, it did succeed in fostering nationalism among the Indians. It also changed power from the British East India Company to Britain itself, as being in control of India, which ultimately made things better for the Indians. It didn't fix everything, but it made it better. And then in China in the late 18 and early 1900s, you see a conservative, anti-Western, anti-Christian rebellion that took the form of basically slaughtering anybody who was pro-Western. It leads to millions of deaths, and as largely, as I said before, the response to these spheres of influence that had been set up against the Chinese, and also the fact that China had signed these humiliating trade agreements. It's agitated by the Empress Dowager at the time, and while it is unsuccessful, it actually leads to more humiliating treaties in that Westerners are forced to come in to put the rebellion down, and therefore they're able to exhume more out of China than they had already been taking. But nevertheless, there were several responses to colonization. Key concept 5.3, Roman numeral 4, the global spread of European political and social thought and the increasing number of rebellions stimulated new transnational ideologies and solidarities. So, discontent with monarchy, imperialism, and industrialization encouraged people to come up with new ideas. So, liberalism was the idea that that it stresses the Enlightenment, freedom, and equality. The Enlightenment had pushed for freedom and equality, and so liberalism was this new way of describing society that embodied those Enlightenment factors. Now, for many people, this hyper individualism and hyper freedom and equality, quote, was not good because it allowed some people to become more wealthy at the expense of others. And so you see the advocation for alternate forms of society, for example, socialism, which was a reaction to industrial capitalism and its inequality that argued for state control of the means of production as opposed to individual control of the means of production. It was one step on the path to communism, which is what Marx and Engels advocate for in the famous Communist Manifesto, a response to industrialization, which is a society in which the means of production are communally owned or not owned by anybody. This, of course, would take many years of training, which is what socialism is for, but should only occur in societies that are able to create enough material abundance that people don't have to worry about that. So, while you need capitalism to create a system that would allow for that material abundance, once capitalism has worn out its welcome, which I would argue has happened, and therefore we should look to these ideas, you can start to move to a more egalitarian society. In addition to this, you also see demand for women's rights gain traction as a result of the Enlightenment. Now, most Enlightenment philosophers are going to be men. However, Mary Wollstonecraft basically put forward enlightened feminism. So she takes from the Enlightenment that women are marginalized as well and should be given equal rights. And this is an idea that is also illustrated by Olympia de Gouges, who responds to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen with the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, saying that women should benefit equally from the French Revolution just as much as men did. So, on that happy note, that's how we reach nirvana. This is your Buddha, signing off.